Listen to podcasts of Joe Walsh and Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy coming to you live from Pulse Technologies in Carroll Stream, part of our AM 560 Signature Bank Business Tour, and of course with Rod Rosenstein's resignation yesterday and the indication that he, like I, count Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson as one of our favorite justices. We're poring over your favorite Robert Jackson decision all morning, taking your calls on that as well.
Exactly. 312-642-5600.
Yeah.
Turnkey.pro answer line.
I've already weighed in with mine. Of course,
Yes.
West Virginia Board of Education.
And
B.
I'm going
Barnett.
to weigh in with mine at 8:59
Sure,
this
you're
morning.
going to want to stay tuned for that.
You're going to love it.
There's a case before the Supreme Court, long overdue, that deals with eliminating male toxicity, among other things, and eliminating this idea, this social construct of gender. I mean, I should say properly legislating it as nothing more than a social construct. You know, I was talking about this case with my male cuddle group.
Oh, that's right. This isn't the snuggle group or the cuddle group?
It's a cuddle group. The men's therapeutic cuddle group, like the one that meets in Pennsylvania. Dr. Christopher Lang, who teaches gender, race, inclusion, and trauma lab at Lehigh University, believes that men's cuddle groups can redefine masculinity, and I'm certainly interested in that. Cuddle parties, like the ones I attend, have been a mainstay of the intimacy industry, which, I'm a longtime supporter of for years.
Always have been, really.
It's if I could define it so that people know, quoting, playful social event designed for adults to explore communication, boundaries, and affection. It's non-sexual, rooted in the idea that human beings crave to be touched and to touch. Joe Biden, a regular attendee.
Exactly. Well, he's a former president, right?
Not just, right. He liked it so much he
he's
bought the
president.
cuddle group.
Right.
By the way, this Christopher Liang was one of the authors of that American Psychological Association guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men, where they basically said, the problem with boys and men is that they're masculine. So now we turn to this Supreme Court case. This is RG and GR Harris Funeral Homes v. EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And the Supreme Court has decided they will hear the case. Oral arguments have not been scheduled yet. The basic issue is whether a court or a government agency can usurp the role of Congress, redefine the word sex in federal law to mean gender identity. The issue is Harris Funeral Homes ministering to grieving families in the Detroit area. The multi-chapel funeral home hired a male employee who agreed to comply with the company policies, including the company's sex-specific dress code. Well, the employee notified the owner that he intended to begin dressing as a woman at work when interacting with the bereaved in violation of the company's dress code. The owner determined that this would not be in the best interest of his clients. He offered the employee a severance package, which the employee refused. The EEOC then targeted the funeral home for prosecution. Now this matter is going to be adjudicated by the High Court in a decision that will have potentially sweeping impact on American society, not to mention employment law. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by John Bursch. He is the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy and a Senior Counselor with the Alliance for Defending Freedom, representing the funeral home in this case. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
So, first of all, if I didn't lay out the facts in the case, please do add or correct. In addition to that, the implications of the Supreme Court's decision in this matter.
The facts that you gave were great. I just wanted to emphasize how unique and special the funeral home context is. In order to serve grieving families, Harris Funeral Homes, like every other funeral home in the United States, understands that it's essential to maintain professional codes of dress and conduct so that employees blend into the background and all the focus is on the grieving family members and friends of the deceased. And so that means no tattoos, no flashy clothing or jewelry or hair, sex-specific dress code. Everybody has to wear all dark clothing. And so you described it exactly right. In 2007, the funeral home hired a male employee who agreed to follow all those policies until 6 years later he didn't, and he expressed his intent to dress as a woman. And it was certainly within the funeral home's right to enforce its dress code. In fact, the EEOC itself has a policy manual that says that companies can have sex-specific dress codes, and the funeral home reasonably determined that this wasn't in the best interest of the grieving family members. So now here we are in the U.S. Supreme Court because the Federal Court of Appeals did something extraordinary. They took Title VII, which was an act that Congress passed in 1964 to prohibit sex discrimination in employment, and said that when they passed that in 1964, sex actually meant gender identity. And so there are two basic problems that are hugely important in this case. One, should judges be able to judicially update enacted federal laws and punish a business for relying on existing law? And two, should we be redefining sex to mean gender identity? And that's the point I'm really hoping we can spend some time talking about this morning, because doing so creates big problems, not just in the area of employment law, but across the board.
Okay, well, let's talk about those big problems across the board. What do you see?
Well, the word sex shows up in lots of different federal statutes. If you replace it with gender identity, here are some of the natural consequences. First, it undermines women's equal opportunities. We're all familiar with Title IX, which gives women and girls the opportunity to compete equally in sports. But consider what just happened in Connecticut. They had their high school women's track finals, and the folks who placed first and second were two male athletes who identified as female. And so they denied two females the ability to win that race. They denied two more females the ability to even compete in that race because they were taking their spots. And because college scholarships are often determined on such things, they're denying women college scholarship opportunities too. So replacing sex with gender identity undermines women's equal opportunities. Second, it jeopardizes bodily privacy rights because it forces organizations to open women's shelters, locker rooms, restrooms, and showers to men who say they are women. And we're all familiar with the ongoing debate in public schools and colleges about whether men who say that they're women should be able to use the women's shower. But another example is up in Anchorage, Alaska. They have a domestic women's abuse overnight shelter. It's for women who are victims of rape, sex trafficking, domestic violence. That gives them a safe place to sleep. There was a man who showed up at the door, said he was a woman, and demanded that he be allowed to sleep 3 feet away from these women victims. And the shelter very compassionately tried to minister him, directed him towards other resources, and now they're in trouble with the Anchorage City Council, which insists that a man should be able to sleep 3 feet away from women who are victims of rape. You've also got problems with freedom of conscience. Doctors who don't want to participate in, or employers who don't want to pay for, surgical efforts to alter sex in violation of their religious beliefs, not to mention endangering freedom of speech, because professors, business owners, and many others are going to be compelled to use an ever-increasing list of compelled pronouns. So, for example, there was a recent Ohio college professor, and he was disciplined for respectfully declining to address a male student in his classroom with feminine pronouns. So you can see how changing sex to mean gender identity creates big problems. And the last place that we should have a change in the law that doesn't have an opportunity to consider all the natural fallout is to have the courts do it by judicially updating federal laws.
What other challenges do you see in your case? I would suspect that one is the fact that you've got a dozen states, including the godforsaken one from where we're broadcasting, that have moved at the state level to allow people to change their sex on their birth certificates. So now the state is sanctioning their gender identity, and for the purposes of the state, I go and change my birth certificate to female. I'm now a female, and therefore everything else that relates to females in terms of anti-discrimination law and the like would ostensibly attach to me.
That's exactly right. That leads to many of the problems that we're talking about, and many more. Even the employee in this specific case testified about how problematic that is. What the employee said is that employers must treat men who believe themselves to be women as if they are women, unless those employees don't meet the expectations of what women typically look like. Well, I don't even know what that means, and I don't know how any reasonable employer could respond to that and say what that means. And if you look at Facebook and places like that, they're now giving folks the opportunity to select from 50, 60, 70 different genders. Well, what's an employer supposed to do with that when someone comes in and they say, I'm category number 27, and you need to treat me in accord with that? Now, the good news for purposes of our case is that the U.S. Supreme Court is not bound by some state definition of what sex means. They're only dealing with what the federal definition means. But it's unfortunate that states have plowed ahead and embraced this move to change sex to mean gender identity without considering the many ramifications and problems that result from that.
And what about this funeral home? I mean, you're right, you need to have uniformity so that you focus on the grieving and, respecting those who've passed away. If you own a company, you set the rules. It just bothers me that the government has to get involved and tell you how to run your business.
That's absolutely right. And not only telling them how to run their business, but then punishing them based on a change in law that the courts implemented as the case was ongoing. And so all of us are familiar with how unfair this would be if we were driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour in a 70-mile-an-hour speed zone and got pulled over, and the officer told us, well, we're changing the meaning of 70. It now means 50. And so you get a ticket for going 20 miles an hour over the speed limit. And you say, well, I had no idea. The sign said 70. The speedometer said 70. And they say, well, too bad. You should have anticipated that we might change the law on you. Well, that's exactly what happened to the business here. Now, thankfully, the EEOC, which is the federal agency which started this whole thing, has now actually admitted that it was wrong below. It admits that it was wrong to bring the case, and it admits that it was wrong to push the idea that changing the definition of sex in Title VII was wrong. And so now it's the ACLU that continues to target the funeral home for punishment and to send all of these other repercussions cascading across society.
And just in terms of where the law is at present, small business owners are, under the law, able to set a dress code in their workplaces, correct?
Absolutely. That has been the law for a long time. In fact, it appears right in the EEOC manual. And what's funny about this case is the ACLU keeps insisting, this was a targeted termination because of the person's transgender status. And it wasn't, because if the employee was a male who identified as a male and wanted to wear women's clothing, that would have violated the dress code. If it was a male who identified as a female and wanted to wear women's clothing, that violated the dress code. If the employee was a man who identified as any other of those 50, 60, 70 genders and dressed in women's clothing, that would be a violation of the dress code. It's simply the funeral home owner doing what's in the best interest of the grieving family members. And what other context would that be more important?
And the play here by the ACLU and the other organizations of the left is just to create add trans as a protected class as it pertains to U.S. law, federal law.
That's correct. And ironically, the Congress has considered and rejected such a proposal numerous times over the last 10 to 15 years. That would appear to be the least good time for a court to step in and say, well, we know better than the people and their democratically elected representatives. We're just going to impose this on everybody and not give Congress an opportunity to create religious exemptions or to account for things like women's equal opportunities in athletics or women's shelters, high school showers and restrooms and locker rooms. That seems like the ideal place that you would want the legislative process doing its best. And your listeners should know that there are two proposals out there already to amend federal law to change sex to mean gender identity. And folks need to be talking to each other and talking to their Congress people to let them know that there are big problems when we define sex. And we've covered some of them today. And so this is not a blanket proposal that anybody should be favoring.
He is John Bursch, Vice President and Vice President of Appellate Advocacy and Senior Counselor with the Alliance for Defending Freedom. John, thanks for joining us. Good luck with the case.
Thank you, Dan and Amy. Have a great day.
You too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560.